As if that didn't happen in the last 20 minutes.
Right. There we go. Okay. Now, can everyone see this? We'll crack on because we're kind of running a bit behind now. But basically, my kind of background. So I've worked in the voluntary sector 15 some years. I did used to run a helpline, so we had lots of difficult conversations. But I would say probably the most relevant thing to this particular session is that I helped to set up a project with a local vet school, training vet students how to have difficult conversations with people, with clients. So that could be around putting animals to sleep or high costs of treatment, that sort of thing. And we used to run kind of role play sessions and that sort of thing with the students. So that's really where I've kind of, developed this skill set. And obviously I apply it on a kind of daily basis to both as a manager and as a volunteer manager. So can you see the second slide? Has it moved on? No further technical difficulties?
All good.
All good.
Perfect. So we're going to talk about what difficult conversations you might have in volunteer management, a bit about what makes them difficult, and how to have better conversations. So what kind of things do we find difficult to talk about with volunteers? Sometimes that could be around performance management. I've been in organisations where people haven't even wanted to raise performance management with a volunteer. If there's an issue with a volunteer's performance, people will be like, yeah, but they're a volunteer, let's not talk about that. Which really, that's not in anyone's best interest. It's not in the interest of the service or the staff or the volunteer themselves to not know when there's kind of room for improvement on things. It could be around things like a concern for their health or well-being, that they're maybe kind of becoming withdrawn, if there's been potentially kind of health or hygiene issues with somebody, that sort of thing. It's really important for us as volunteer managers to have that kind of duty of care and to have these conversations with people. Or it could be, I think, very pertinent in the sector at the moment, it could be due to organisational change. And sometimes, particularly volunteers that are quite long-serving, that can be quite difficult to raise with people. It might mean that the way that people volunteer or the people that they volunteer with could be changing substantially, and that can be quite difficult to bring up. So, what about these topics do we find difficult? So sometimes that is to do with not knowing how to broach subjects, which is part of the reason that we're talking today. With volunteers, quite often people are worried that maybe their volunteer will stop volunteering if they have a negative experience, if they feel like someone's kind of having a go at them. So sometimes people think, as I say, some organisations, it's easier to just not have that conversation with them and just to ignore kind of that behaviour or that performance issue. It might be that you just don't really have the time in the day to do it well. Lots of reasons for people not engaging with these topics as and when they come up. But the reasons that we should have these conversations is that it can improve performance and lead to even better volunteers. It can support people's health and wellness and just generally, if they feel that they're cared about, if they know that if they're struggling, they can get time off or that you can be a bit flexible with them, same as it would be with staff. That does mean that they're generally going to feel better and more comfortable in their volunteering role. And it makes people feel cared about more generally, that they know that the organisation, they're not just a bum on a seat to you, that actually you care about them, you care about their development, and you care about the time that they spend with you. So my main thing around what people quite often call difficult conversations is that I think we think about that wrongly. When you call it a difficult conversation, it's almost like you're walking into thinking, oh, this is going to be tough, I really don't want to do this. Whereas actually, quite often, the reason that we find these conversations difficult is because they're about quite important topics. If the topic wasn't important, why would we bother to do it at all? You could just let it slide. So when you're thinking about, oh, I've got to have this conversation with somebody, that's not going to be nice, don't think about it that way. Think, these are the reasons I should have this conversation. This is what's going to improve. This is something that we need to do. It's important. When we do it well, it means that you can resolve any issues and you can move past them. It means that you're going to have better volunteer well-being. It can help to improve performance. It can lead to happier teams overall because nobody's feeling kind of resentment or anything because there's things that have gone undealt with, or because people feel like, oh, they get away with murder or whatever. It leads to better understanding across your teams, which also leads to more trust and psychological safety within a team. What to do before you have a difficult and interesting conversation, important conversation. Make sure that you've planned it. Don't just jump into it. Oh, this thing's popped into my head. Let's talk to so-and-so about their lateness, whatever it may be. Don't ever do it spur of the moment. Always plan it in. Make sure that you've got the time to do it, that there's a private space for you to have that conversation. Don't do it on a reception or in an open office or things like that. Make a note of any facts and stick to them. Make sure, so if you say, oh, you're always late, it needs to be, so I've noticed your last 3 shifts that you've come in, you've been really late, this had an impact on these other parts of the service, or whatever the issue might be. Stick to the facts. Don't put your own personal slants or feelings onto that. Decide what acceptable outcomes are. So it might be that if somebody has had an issue with another volunteer and they're bickering and it's causing problems, what are the acceptable outcomes? What do you want to see from your perspective that you can feel that you can move past that and it's going to create a better environment for everybody? You don't need to be stuck to that. That's a kind of a starting point, but do decide what you think your kind of desirable outcomes are going to be. And think about organisational values in the role description. So particularly if you're looking at performance management, if they're doing things, you've been stroppy with that person or whatever it might be, not that you would say that in that way to somebody, but look at, one of our organisational values is dignity. We didn't feel you were treating this person with dignity when you did X, Y, Z. So tie it back to the organisational values or things in the role description. Again, if it was something like lateness, in a lot of roles that just doesn't matter, but in some roles it might be, well, if you're late, this other volunteer can't get away for their lunch or can't get home or whatever it is. So think about what it is in the role that says that what they're doing is not really appropriate for that role, what things are they doing well, and what things are looking to be improved. Being prepared, so you want to be assertive and confident in your perspective on the situation. A lot of people kind of say that assertiveness is a bit kind of harsh. I think assertive is absolutely where you want to be. I think some people say that being assertive is kind of too much with volunteers, but actually it's just about having those firm boundaries, knowing what you want to get out of it, and just being firm and bounded so everyone knows where they stand. Do try and have an open mind. So while I say have it in your head what kind of reasonable outcomes would be for you, don't be tied to that. It might be that something comes out of the conversation that while it's not what you'd thought about, it might actually be an equally reasonable outcome for that. You don't know what their side of things is. It might be going back to something like lateness or snippiness. It might be that that person is going through some stuff at home. It might be they have a health issue. There might be things that have happened to them that you're not aware of. So just let them have their say as well. It's a conversation. It's not telling people what they should be doing. Concentrate on where you need to get get a positive outcome. So make sure you've got those goals in mind. And maybe talk it through with a trusted colleague before you have the actual conversation. You don't want it to be scripted. You don't want to be going in and going this, but you want to kind of maybe have a note of those key themes and just talk it through with a colleague in terms of, does it sound reasonable to them? Do they understand where you're coming from? That sort of thing before you do Sorry?
It's fine, I put them on mute.
Oh, okay. So actually during the conversation with somebody, what we want to be thinking about, oh, my things have disappeared, okay. During the conversation, it's really important when you're going to talk to someone about something that they might find uncomfortable, it's really important to give the right signals to them to sort of reassure them so that people understand what the conversation's about and they don't get a fright. So for example, with the vet students, don't burst into a room with a big smile on your face to tell someone you're about to put their dog to sleep. Make sure that your body language and your tone are in keeping with the conversation that you want to have. If you're popping something in someone's diary to have a conversation, it can be really tempting when you're having this kind of conversation. You're like, oh, I don't want to tell them what that's about because I don't want them to worry about it. But actually putting like a vague kind of, can I talk to you at 2:00 on Tuesday can actually be worse for people than saying, there was an incident in a meeting last week. I'd really like to talk about it. I'd really like to hear your side of X, Y, Z. Can we talk about how your volunteering's going? Something like that, so that they are a little bit prepared for what the conversation is going to be. Then kind of verbal signposting is really useful as well. So that could be things like, I know this might be difficult for you to hear, but I'd like to talk to you about this. Or I'm aware some things have happened and I'd like to get your side on that. Or just letting them know that this isn't necessarily going to be, a shiny, happy chat about your holidays over a cup of tea. And then making sure that your body language is appropriate to the conversation as well. Don't have a big fixed smile on your face if you're asking someone about potentially, a difficult home situation that's been impacting their volunteering. Make sure that you're kind of matching their body language and that you're not leading them down a path that you're not going down. Don't put on big fake smiles or look really kind of angry, because sometimes people get stressed about these sorts of things and they give off really negative body language, whereas it's because they are stressed about having this conversation, when actually it's not really anything that bad. So be aware of your body language and the language that you're using as well. Okay, some really useful techniques for having difficult conversations. Silence is one of my favourite things, both in having difficult conversations and in conflict resolution. Sometimes it's good to just give it a minute. Let the person, sometimes people could be thinking, sometimes they might need a bit more time to process and to decide what they're going to say back. Some people think, well, if I don't say anything, you'll have to say something, and then the conversation will move on. So sometimes you just need to wait and let the person give you their answer. So silence is a great tool. Don't leave people sitting for 20 minutes, but just give it a couple of minutes, usually more than kind of 30, sit in silence for 30 seconds, and it actually feels like a really long time. But sometimes people just need that couple of minutes. If it goes on for a longer time, you can maybe say something like, do you have any thoughts on that? What, is there anything else you'd like to talk about? How are you finding this meeting? Are we on the same lines? These types of things. Give them a bit of a prompt, but don't try and fix. Just let the silence sit for a few minutes and let the person respond. The other thing that I really love is repetition. So if you're getting to a point with somebody and they go, oh, but I know I don't like Sally, but I've not done anything, blah, blah, blah. If you get kind of stuck in no, but I need you to think about this thing and I need you to do this in a different way, and you keep coming back to, oh, but whatever, or going down different routes, sometimes just coming back to, so my issue today is this meeting that we had and the way that you spoke to Sally. How are we going to move past that? And just keep bringing it back to the core problem and making sure that you don't go down a rabbit hole of, and this other thing and that other thing, and this volunteer did this, that you're coming back to, no, but this is what we need to talk about today. Can we just move this along and see if we can find a resolution together? Then,
sorry to interrupt. I think your lanyard is hitting your microphone,
oh,
making a
sorry.
Okay. All good. Thank you.
Great day. This is just going so well. So the other thing, as I've said a couple of times already, I'll try not to use the desk either because it's super creaky. Don't ever write yourself a script, but just having those key points that you want to cover and just making sure you hit them, almost like a bingo list. You don't necessarily have to read down them in order, but if you've got those key points that you want to get across, and just even in your head, just tick them off as you go so that you've covered everything that you want to. Because there's nothing worse than coming out of a meeting that you might have found difficult when you've had something really important to say and coming out and going, oh God, I didn't talk about that thing that I was supposed to. So if you just get it all done in a 1 hour, you've got all your key points in front of you, that just keeps you right and makes sure that the message that you want to get across is actually what comes out of that meeting. Sorry, I keep closing this, it keeps coming back. Do remember, in these types of conversations, you are not responsible for how somebody else reacts. I think that's one of the big things when we're having what's potentially going to be an uncomfortable conversation with somebody, is you're sitting there thinking, what if they do this? What if they do that? What if they decide they don't want to volunteer anymore? What if they go and tell all the other volunteers how terrible I am? You kind of build it up in your own head. And most of those things are probably not going to happen. You're probably overthinking that and over-dramatizing it in your own head. But also, you are never responsible for how somebody else chooses to behave. If you have gone through your planning, if you've made sure that you have been sensitive and covered all the bases, been really factual, you've done the best you possibly can, you've not done anything wrong. If somebody behaves in a really negative way off the back of that, That's not on you. That's on that person and how they've chosen to react with that information. So don't ever take someone else's reactions and behaviours to something home with you, if that makes sense. After one of these meetings, it's not a done deal. It's not, right, I've spoken to that person, that's it, job done. Make sure that you do complete any actions. So that's making sure that they've done anything that you've said that they should be doing, that you've completed anything that you said that you would do. Just make sure any follow-up has actually happened. Do diary any follow-up meetings. So when you come out of the meeting, pop in another one. If you've said you're going to reconvene, make sure you've got that in the diary and you've done it. So it's there. It's not, nobody's going to put it off. If you go on holiday, you're not going to forget about it. You know, and they know when you're going to pick it up again and how that's going to happen. And do for yourself, evaluate how you feel that went for your own development. And the more you do these kind of conversations, the more confident you'll become with them. So if you can sit down and go, right, well, I would have done this differently, but actually this, and this went really well, then that will build your confidence. Or if it didn't go so well, you can think, well, how will I do this differently the next time? Another thing around following things up, sometimes the conversation will go badly. It might be that the person's really upset. It might be that the person's really angry. Sometimes you do just feel that you're not getting to that stage where you can actually resolve it. And it is fine to say, okay, this is where we are today. I don't think we're going to get past this. Let's go away and have a think and reconvene. That's absolutely fine, but I would say make sure that kind of by the end of that day, you've got something in the diary and that you've got a note that you will follow up and that it's not just going to kind of drift, because you don't want people to think, oh, well, we had a meeting, I got upset, that's it, it's over now. You want to make sure that that is being followed up and that things are going to move forward. So it's fine to say, okay, we're done for today. I don't think this is getting us anywhere any longer. Let's pick it up another day, but just make sure you've got that in the diary and that you know that that is going to happen and that they know that that is going to happen. Okay, so we can do this as a bit of a chat thing, potentially as a group. Think about an important conversation that you have been meaning to have. That could be with a volunteer, that could be with a co-worker, that could be any situation, could be with your teenager, whatever it is. Have a little think about that situation, why you've been putting it off, and then think through your planning stages and how you're going to actually work through that and have that conversation. Okay, can I stop sharing? There we go. Sorry, that was very much a whirlwind too. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. Were there any questions in the chat? Any thoughts? Anything? Oh, there are things in the chat.
I love that you said about that. You know, it's actually funny that we titled that handling difficult conversations. But I think that kind of summarized of what the topic was about. But you're right, they're important conversations. I think also from my experience about handling conversation, a lot of times volunteers are donors. And I think people are very worried about upsetting donors. And then, so I think also sometimes we do need to be cautious of it. And I'm not saying they don't need to happen, but then just from my experience, I think sometimes you do need to, let's say no, let head of fundraising or the CEO know that this conversation needs to happen, whether it's they do it or you do it. It doesn't mean they get to be let off because they're donors, but something to think about as well.
Absolutely. And I think these things have ripples. So particularly if it's known that one particular volunteer might be a donor or otherwise kind of linked with the organisation more than some of the other volunteers, if they're getting away with things or behaving in a different way, or other volunteers see that, and it can lead to a really negative culture, like, oh, well, you know, the volunteers that give money, they are kind of a higher standing than the rest of us volunteers, that kind of thing. And it can lead to quite a lot of bad feelings. So yeah, absolutely. If there's behaviours that need to be had, they need to be had. It's conversations around behaviours, that need to be had, that needs to happen. It's not a case of, oh, well, we'll let them off. They just come in for 3 hours a week and do X, Y, Z. It's about organisational culture and values and making sure that everybody is treated the same, and kind of, if things need to be said to them, it's happening in the same way that it is with anybody else. Yeah, absolutely.
Susan has asked a question. Conversations that are difficult for me are with long-term volunteers who have been doing things a certain way for a long time, which aren't appropriate. I think sometimes when you come into an organization,
Yeah,
you inherit the volunteers, and anytime you make
absolutely.
any changes, you're kind of pushed back with the volunteers who have been there the longest. So
Mhm.
what would you, and someone's actually saying same for me. So what, how would you handle that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, I mean, people are aware that things change. People do know health. If someone's been doing something for 20 years, things like health and safety will be different. All kinds of things will be different. I think there's a certain amount around that really factual content. We might have been doing X, Y, Z. You might have been lone working in the charity shop on a Saturday afternoon, but the organisational policy is we need to have two people there, or whatever it is. It's back to that factual, this is why this thing exists, this is what we need you to do. And, I'm really sorry that that isn't how it has been in the past. And it might be a bit upsetting for you that things are going in a different direction, but this is what has to happen. This is an organisational decision. I mean, I used to work years ago in a fundraising team, and they had a little tiny charity shop. It was quite not remote, but it wasn't in a kind of busy city centre. And they had this team of very older ladies, like they were all in their 80s and 90s, that had been running this charity shop for years. And they're like, we're struggling now, we struggle moving the stock, we struggle with this, that, and the other. We need some younger people in to do the kind of heavy lifting for us. So we recruited some students, sent them in to see them, and they were like, well, we don't want them. When we said younger, we meant younger, older people. We want people in their 50s and 60s. And they're like, no, no, get rid of those students. We don't want them. And it's like, this isn't your shop though. We can't put out adverts. It's discriminatory for us to put out adverts. Please come volunteer if you're 50 or 60. You just had to explain to them, this shop will fold. If we don't get other volunteers in, this shop will not be able to function anymore. You can't do the heavy lifting. You need support to do it. We can't just pick and choose who it is that we get to do that. We need to get the best volunteers for the role. And it's really difficult. And sometimes in those situations, you will lose volunteers. Sometimes if you're bringing in new things, new processes, whatever it is, sometimes people will just be like, no, that doesn't suit me. I'm not interested. And I think it's kind of having the confidence to say, but actually, we can't just make an exception for you because you've been doing that a long time, because you think that you know that way better. If this is an organisational decision, we need to go with this. We need to make sure that this is happening. And, you can be reasonable, you can have all the conversations with people. But I think retaining volunteers at all costs is not what we should be looking to do. We should be looking to have the right volunteers in the right roles, doing the right things. And if that's not working, unfortunately, sometimes that does mean that you're going to lose volunteers because of it. Oh,
Dot's question, I think Dot, if you can ask your question, as a volunteer having this conversation with another volunteer, do I need to document anything, everything? You're saying you're both volunteers. Dot, are you a volunteer as well? If you're a volunteer managing volunteers in a volunteer capacity, then yes, I would
I
say
would. Yeah, absolutely. So I'm a trustee of an entirely volunteer run dog rescue. And if I were to have a conversation with like one of our fosterers about something that I felt wasn't going to go well, not even in a like formal one-to-one way, but I would even just summarize that to them in an email and say, this conversation that we had today, you said this, I said that, we have decided together, this is what we're going to do. And then if you get a couple of months down the line or something else happens, you can go back to that and say, do you remember this email? Do you remember this conversation? This is what we have agreed. What's going on? Like, why is this thing not happening? So I would say, I wouldn't necessarily say as a volunteer that needs to be a kind of formal one-to-one kind of thing, because it's a different way of working. But I would definitely say just follow up with something in writing to say that this is what we've discussed, this is kind of where we are.
Yeah. And I think also just to point out, I think it does come after practice. I remember with my role as a volunteer manager, when I had to have that first conversation, I asked my manager to do it first and I sat
Yeah.
in whilst he handled it. And then I was given the confidence, and then he was like, okay, you follow up and you do this. And that helped me loads, is don't be afraid to ask for support. You're, like I said, we wear many hats. We're not meant to be able to just do everything. So if you can learn from a manager, I think that's also really helpful.
Yeah.
Jean has brought up a really good, I like this. I like to start the conversation with, how is it going?
Yes.
This often has the volunteer approach the problem, and then we can resolve it together, a win-win. It works 95% of the time.
Absolutely. Like quite often, I mean, most people are a certain amount of self-aware. Quite often, people will know that something has happened that might not be the best. Or they'll know that kind of, they've not been as engaged or whatever it is, or that they've got stuff going on at home that might be impacting. People will usually, not everybody, but people will usually have some kind of an idea, and like you say, might just present that themselves and say, oh, actually, this thing happened with this other person. This thing happened with a staff member last week. I wasn't really happy how it went. And actually, there are 10 sides to every story. It might be if a staff member has complained about a volunteer or whatever, it might not necessarily be that situation has been what's presented. So yeah, absolutely. Always don't ever go in going, you've done this and this is wrong. And as I say, you don't want to go in with a script and be like, this is what's happened. It should be a conversation. It should be a listening exercise. And definitely, yeah, two-way street.
Yeah. Okay, Susan has asked, conversations that are difficult for me are with long-term volunteers who have been doing things. Oh, sorry. We've
Done that one.
Someone says, also relying on existing processes helps when discussing long-standing incorrect behavior, as long as the processes have the right information. I think that's really true.
Processes, values, role description. These are factual information that you can hang things on. You can see, look, this is what we're supposed to be doing. This is what you've done. And, as I say again, behaviors can be quite difficult, but if you link that back to your values, our values say that this is how we should be behaving, and you've been doing this thing. So yeah, absolutely.
I always had any volunteer, whether it was a casual volunteer role, always have a role description about what's expected of them, because then when it comes to, I don't like the word supervision, I think there's a better way.
No.
But when you do have your catch-ups, you bring out the role description and say, are you coping with this, this, and this? If not, we can split the role. You tell me what you can do on this role, and then we can find another volunteer to role share with you. Like, how can we help you? But sometimes they think they can do it all, and then it's not, and it's not beneficial for either parties.
Or they might be absolutely running with it and getting bored, and then it's like, well, actually, this is all you signed up to do. Maybe we should be looking at this bit, So it's really important to have that kind of baseline for what the expectation is. Just keep everybody on the same page.
Yeah, and when you have those chats with volunteers, and like you say, document everything, so it's not coming out of nowhere. Like, oh, it's mentioned this, and this. We've mentioned it. Claire has said, any tips for saying thanks but no thanks at a time of recruitment?
Absolutely. Same thing again, back to your role description, back to your values. I always try wherever possible to not have an outright no. If there's other, if someone applies for a kind of member, like a service user facing really kind of meaty role, and you look at them and think, oh, you're as green as the new mown grass, we can't do that. It's like, are there other things within our organisation that potentially you could do, and then kind of build up to that sort of thing. So I usually like to have a conversation with someone if I think they would be a good volunteer and they just don't have the right experience for that. It's like, okay, what could we do to get you there? If it's that someone comes in and you're just like, oh, wow, no, then it's back to the whole kind of values thing around, our organizational values are around this. I kind of picked up on this thing, or, possibly we're not the right fit for you as an organization. It's kind of easier with specifics. Have you got a specific one that I can kind of?
No, but I think if I remember correctly, I think someone had a template of like a really nice email saying like, you've not been successful in the role. So if anyone does have a template email that they can share with us, I don't know if anyone on the call has one, or I can find one and share it. I think I love a good template email because I'm not very good at writing emails sometimes. So I think just a nice template email of thanks but no thanks in a very nice way. But look out for our different roles. Here's our website.
And I think as well, things like, who's your local volunteer centre or NCVO or whatever, you can find other opportunities here, that kind of thing. And then if someone's really like, oh, why did I not get this? To maybe have that conversation around, this is what we look for in this role. In the same way that you would with paid staff, these are the things that we feel we're missing from your particular application. Particularly, I wouldn't do that with everybody, but if you've interviewed someone, it's really difficult as a volunteer manager to meet someone, interview with them, and have them just not be a good fit. I had a lady once wanted to do a member facing, really kind of raw frontline role, and she had a huge amount of mental health stuff going on. And I just really honestly said to her, I sat down with her and I said, look, I don't feel that you're in a place, I don't think this would be good for you as an individual to put yourself, to get all this vicarious trauma. I don't think that's a good thing for you. I'm not saying don't come back, absolutely, in the future, absolutely come back. But I mean, she was, talking about sort of baby loss and all kinds of things like in her interview. And it's like, oh no, you're not in a place that you can kind of interact in a safe way with our demographic. So
brilliant. Eugene also said, to this point, I think it's always great to have connections with other local non-profits where you can see if the volunteer may be a better fit somewhere else due to their skill set.
yeah,
You could connect them to another organization if they aren't a great fit for yours. I think that's really good to maybe just have a set of links in that template email saying, have a look at XYZ. Heather said, I'd agree with being transparent and honest about fit from the off, much easier than picking up the pieces later.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Someone did ask in a previous, in our preset question, someone said about health wise. If someone really wants to volunteer and they think they're healthy to do it, but they're not suitable, how do you approach that when it's something quite,
I think it depends on what it is. I mean, as I say, I have had conversations with people who have come out with, I'm trying to think of a polite way to say this, like really sort of Daily Mail comments about homelessness while in a meeting. Like while in an interview to work in a homelessness organisation, like, oh, our food kitchen, if people just kind of got up and got jobs kind of thing. And it's like, I don't think you're a good fit for our organisation. I don't think this, and I don't think we're kind of going towards the same cause. This is what we want to do. And I am not feeling from you that is your headspace and that's what you want to do. And maybe these other organisations would be a better fit. I had actually had a volunteer that somehow crept under the radar and had lots of like really, really judgy kind of thoughts and comments about homelessness after she'd started. And she'd gone out to an event with some other volunteers and been saying really awful things about like people all being junkies and alcoholics and all kinds of things to other volunteers at an event that was public. Not saying it to the general public, but saying it to the other volunteers. And two separate volunteers that don't know each other came to me separately and said, oh, this woman, these things that she said. And I did just sit her down and I said, look, these are the things that I have been told that you say. These things are not in line with our values. And she didn't say that she hadn't said them. She just said, oh, but actually it was because I was thinking this, it was because I was thinking that. And it's like, no, but from my perspective, you can see how this looks and you can see how this looks to the other volunteers. And we can't have volunteers representing an organisation that are saying these things about our demographic. And I mean, that was a horrible conversation to have. She hit the roof. She was calling me all kinds of everything and, what a horrible person I was and how I'd been against her from the start and all kinds of things. And that's when it's like, but that's not on me. Two separate volunteers have told me that her behaviour is not in line with our values. She didn't deny that when I spoke to her. She just said, oh, but that's how it is. We can't have people like that volunteering in the organisation. And it's horrible. It's a horrible thing to have to do. But at the same time, you're thinking about like, how did those other volunteers feel at that event, having that said to them? And you can't be seen to have that sort of thing happening because the psychological safety of everyone else, to get a really good team together that are going to work well together and feel like they're all working for the same goal. Everybody needs to feel comfortable and safe in that. And so if somebody isn't kind of in line with those values, they need to go. And it's horrible, but that's how it is.
Really thick skin, I think, and like I'm quite a sensitive person, and I wouldn't say I have the thickest skin. So it's, I think, definitely, for your own to protect your own mental health, lean on your manager.
Yeah.
And especially, I think also if you're having sensitive topics that you might think, could result, can be discriminatory or anything like that, also speak to HR.
Yeah.
I think it's also really important. You don't want to get yourself in hot water or anything. Someone, how would you as volunteer manage a coach who isn't following the group protocol? They own the venue, so difficult, concerned about exclusion. Ginny, do you want to expand on that?
Yeah, so nothing to do with the body that I'm here with today, but in my qualification as a coach, obviously I have a good understanding, but my concern is that the coach isn't following their own protocol and rules of how they would manage children in particular. But because they own the venue where the club is based, for me as a volunteer, it's very difficult to raise anything because I'm worried about being excluded or discarded, if you like, from the group.
Yeah.
How do you manage that?
I mean, that's a really difficult one. If it's someone that kind of owns a venue, it's back to that thing that we'd said about donors, though. It's the same sort of thing. It's like somebody shouldn't be allowed just to do whatever the hell they like just because of what they are other than a volunteer. Is there someone like senior to both of you that you could speak to about it?
Not within the venue itself. There is a governing body that's above this sort of level who I could go to, but obviously I'm very concerned about the ramifications of doing that.
Yeah. So are you so do you sort of supervise her in terms of as a volunteer you supervise this person, but this person owns the venue? Is that
Yeah, so this is not with regards to what you can see on my
no.
screen as being okay. This is me as a parent being a volunteer on a committee
Right,
for another sport that my children
right,
attend, and the coach there, their parents own the venue, and
right.
they have this culture of we can do what we like, and if you don't like it, but because I'm a trained coach, I'm already aware that certain things that are in their constitution,
Yeah,
safeguarding, they're not following it,
yeah,
and I try and say, actually, don't think you should be doing that. I'm then treated differently because of it. So it's very difficult.
right.
And I can't just go somewhere else for it.
Yeah, I mean that almost feels like that isn't a conversation if you're worried about the ramifications of it, which it sounds like quite rightly that is those are the sorts of people that are going to then have a grudge against you or treat you differently. Is it something that you could maybe kind of subtly, like, kind of anonymously go to the governing body about, or a kind of like, these things are happening in this service. I am concerned about XYZ. If it's young people, that's potentially a safeguarding issue. Like that's,
Yeah.
that's quite a serious. And I would point out to a governing body, like these are quite often when people go, oh, but that's just a little thing. Like, oh yeah, I didn't wait for someone else, and I sent everyone else home and locked up myself, but it's fine, or whatever it is. It's like, but you need to think in these situations of worst case scenario. What's the worst thing that could happen if people aren't doing what they're supposed to be doing? And working in any sort of children or youth service, there are really serious ramifications for not following protocol and not doing things how they're supposed to do. So I would go back to that factual, this is what is happening, this is the potential ramifications of this. What as a governing body are you doing about it? And if you can do that in an anonymous way, because it does sound like that's something that's potentially going to kind of come back to you, unfortunately. But yeah, I mean, I think I really struggle. I find it really struggle. I really struggle to kind of turn my back on things that are being done poorly that shouldn't be, that are going to impact other people. Like to sort of keep your mouth shut and just kind of sit there. It's like, no, but this needs to be sorted though. So I totally get where you're coming from. But yeah, that is a really difficult one, unfortunately. Yeah.
I'm just conscious of the time.
Mhm.
Just if anyone does have any templates of, how to, structure these conversations, or any email templates that they want to share with, please email me and I'll share it with the rest of you guys. But I want to say thank you so much, Jenny, and I'm so sorry about
I'm so sorry. That was I don't know why the second link worked when the first one didn't. I don't know.
Either
Weird.
way, you managed to present, you
We
managed to
got
offer us. I love
there.
I loved it, and I really, really appreciate your time. So thank you very much, and I will do a follow-up email with the recording and any relevant information, and also information on our next few lunch and learns, which I'm very excited about. So thank you very much again, Jenny, and thank you all for joining.
Thanks,
Thank you,
everyone.
everyone.
Nice to meet
Bye
you
bye.
all.